Hey everybody, welcome to the first and only video lecture for the course introduction module. In this lecture, I'm going to situate Congress in the overall system of checks and balances. And I'm going to do this relatively quickly because this is not a civics class where you need to know all of the checks and balances and have a diagram and see all of the ways in which the three branches check each other. What I want to do in this lecture is give a kind of a spiritual overview of the place that Congress occupies in the system of checks and balances. Congress is outlined in Article 1 of the Constitution, and it's because Congress is, the legislative branch is the foundational branch of government. When you're setting up a representative democracy, the voice of the people is heard first in the legislature. The legislature is the foundational policy-making body. The executive branch and the judicial branch have important roles, but they only have roles that get actuated once the legislature has done something. So Congress's place in the system of check and balances is essentially the originator of all things. Now, the executive branch and the judicial branch are described and limited and outlined and elaborated in Articles 2 and 3, but there's a big difference between what the Constitution does in Article 1 and what it does in Articles 2 and 3. Article 2 on the executive branch spends a lot of words on the selection of the executive and on on the special powers that the executive has, but there's not a lot of detail. There's no detail at all about what the executive branch looks like. Article 3, which is actually very short, lists the appellate and original jurisdiction powers of the judicial branch, mentions that it's lifetime appointments, but really is very sparse and leaves a lot up to the imagination, but not our imagination, but the imagination of Congress. One of the biggest pieces of our constitutional system that situates Congress in the overall system of checks and balances is that the executive and judicial branches are left essentially undescribed, unstructured, unelaborated in the Constitution itself, and Congress is given the power as well as the responsibility for creating these structures. The reason why there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court is because Congress decided that. The reason that there are 3 layers of courts, district courts, trial courts, appellate courts, and then the Supreme Court, instead of 4 layers or instead of a different type of system that's not so pyramidal and hierarchical in nature, is because Congress created this system that way. The reason why there is the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, the Department of State, in the Environmental Protection Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Communications Commission. The reason why all of these executive departments and agencies exist and have the structure and the powers and responsibilities they have is because Congress created them. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, et cetera, none of these officers are mentioned in the Constitution. The only executive branch officers mentioned are the president and the vice president. And their special powers and election methods are laid out. Congress decides what the executive branch looks like. Congress decides what the judicial branch looks like. So from the point of view of checks and balances, already there's a supreme importance in the legislature that doesn't exist in the other 2 branches. Not to say that what each of these 3 branches does is either more or less important than what the other one does, or that the powers that the office holders in each of these 3 branches have aren't balanced in certain ways. But in the overall architecture of the constitutional system, Congress is foundational. One of the ways in which Congress checks the power of the executive branch is by having essentially this overarching control over the structure as well as the regulatory mandates. One of the reasons why, for example, the Department of Health and Human Services has some discretion in how it distributes subsidy monies for the Obamacare exchanges, and why it has the ability to extend deadlines through the IRS for tax filing, is because Congress has given discretionary power to these agencies. And in fact, every agency in the executive branch has some level of discretionary power that has been given to it either on purpose or by accident. In other words, by things that aren't mentioned, creates cracks in the regulatory and statutory structure of the executive branch that allows executive branch officials room to maneuver. But in a lot of cases, Congress has actually given that discretion directly and intentionally to those agencies. For example, the IRS has the power to extend the deadline for tax filing for income taxes. And in fact, it just did so from April 15th to May 17th at the urging of some congressional leaders. But it was essentially an urging and a request of congressional leaders. And it was the commissioner of the IRS who actually had the power to make that decision and could have decided not to. Now, if Congress wanted to override a decision that was either made or not made by an executive branch agency that had some kind of discretion, it always has that power. Let's say that the IRS commissioner decided not to extend the deadline for filing for whatever reason. If Congress had passed a law extending that deadline automatically, and if that law was passed, was signed into law by the president, or if it was vetoed by the president and then overridden by Congress, then Congress gets to tell the executive branch officials what to do in those cases where they normally have discretion. Now, that's not the case for the judicial branch, but Congress has set up and gets to continue setting up rules for procedure. Many of the criminal procedures that are used in, and civil procedures used in federal courts come from statutes that are passed by Congress. Many of them also come from Supreme Court rulings about what the Constitution requires, for example, in criminal defendants' rights, or in other kinds of procedures that have to do with due process of law. So the source of regulation and restriction and empowerment and discretion in the judicial branch come partly from Congress and partly from the Supreme Court's own rulings about what the Constitution requires and allows the judicial branch to do. For example, the Exclusionary Rule, which came as a result of a case in 1964, Mapp versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court said that evidence that is obtained in violation of the Constitution can't be admitted in a criminal trial. Now, that came from a Supreme Court ruling, but that rule could have been passed by Congress as part of its statutory regulation of the criminal justice procedures. And if you go to law school and you study criminal procedure first year, you're going to study a big book that's a mixture of statutes and court precedent that determines what those cases look like. So Congress has a decent level of input, if not a full level of input, into what the judicial branch does. Whereas in the executive branch, basically Congress always has either told the executive branch agencies what they can and can't do, what discretion they do and don't have, and always has the ability to override that. For another example, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has a broad regulatory mandate to actually create regulations in the telecommunications industry that the commissioners see fit. And with a vote of 3 commissioners out of 5 can pass any kind of regulation. For example, net neutrality is one of those regulations that was passed by the FCC. Congress, if it doesn't like one of those regulations, can always repeal it or override it with a statute that changes that regulation in whatever direction Congress wants to. So that power is always there. Now, functionally, because Congress, as we will see throughout this course, and I'm just going to lay this down here in this lecture without further elaborating on why it's the case, but because Congress is a very status quo oriented decision-making body, when there is a grant of regulatory power or when there's an area of discretion that exists in the executive branch, it's very unlikely that Congress is going to be able to change the decision that's made in the executive branch to either repeal a regulation passed by the FCC or to force the hand of somebody like the IRS commissioner. Even though it's possible in constitutional theory, in actual practice, that's very difficult to do. Imagine if the IRS commissioner had decided not to extend the tax filing deadline by a month and congressional leaders wanted that to happen. first of all, to get that passed through both houses of Congress would be tricky, even if a lot of members of Congress agreed that this was an important thing to do. And then let's say that the reason the IRS commissioner didn't do it was because the president didn't want it to happen. The president could always veto that, and then a veto override is even more difficult to get through. When Congress tries to tie the hands of the executive branch in this very direct way, the veto is a really big obstacle. The veto is not necessarily a huge obstacle in the legislative process in general, as we'll see when we look at the legislative process in the next module, but it is definitely a big obstacle and an important check that the president has on the legislative branch as the legislative branch attempts to transform the way it has in the past structured, regulated, empowered, and restricted the executive branch. So theoretically, the legislative branch is essentially, I won't say all powerful, but nearly all powerful. We've heard, recently, of course, that plans or possibilities of extending the, expanding the Supreme Court, that is fully within the power of Congress. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that can't happen. Political tradition, political reality, what would be the blowback from that? Those are things that stand in the way, and those are factors that contribute to Congress being a status quo oriented type of institution. But there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing about what the legislature is allowed to do that prevents that kind of structural remaking of the judicial branch. The same thing is true of the executive branch. And in fact, in our lifetimes, it's happened multiple times that the legislature has restructured the executive branch. The most recent, biggest, most important one was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, which created a brand new cabinet department, very powerful, and brought in a lot of different agencies from different departments under the umbrella of Homeland Security. And that was proposed by President Bush and the Bush administration as a response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. But the plan itself had to be approved by Congress. There is some reorganization of the executive branch that can be done by executive order, but not a whole lot. So Congress has this foundational power to structure, empower, restrict, or provide discretion to the other two branches of government. And that is a really important role. How broadly and effectively and transformatively that can be actually done, that power can actually be used, is, again, it's a subject we're going to look at a lot in this class. How effectively can Congress actually move on the powers that it has? Now, probably the biggest check and balance check that Congress has on the power of the other two branches, I should say not one, but there are two. One is the appointment process, and this is a special power of the Senate, not of Congress as a whole. The president gets to appoint an awful lot of people to the executive branch, thousands of political appointments, as well as lots of people to the judicial branch. And that's not just Supreme Court appointments, that's appellate court judges and district court judges as well. Presidents typically get dozens of judicial appointments in a single term, even if they get zero or only one Supreme Court appointment. So presidents appoint a lot of people, and those people occupy offices that have a lot of discretion. Appellate court judges, Supreme Court justices, district trial judges, executive branch political appointees, they all have they have the ability to make decisions on their own that affect people's lives in a very detailed and daily type of way. Congress's ability, of course, foundationally, especially for executive branch appointees, to override those decisions exists in theory, but in practice, it's very difficult. But in practice, what the Senate can do is prevent presidents from appointing people to those powerful discretionary positions that fall outside of what the members of the Senate, or at least half the members of the Senate, feel like is appropriate. So that's the appointment power. Confirmation power is a pretty important one for the daily operation of the executive branch. And that's particularly true because Congress has put so much over the years, so much discretionary power and so many resources directly in the hands of executive branch officials that controlling who is making the decisions is actually a really important check on the power of the executive branch. Controlling what those decisions are, of course, is an important power, but again, and you'll hear this from me time and time again, in practice, it's very difficult for Congress to override a regulation that's been passed by an executive branch agency, or to force the hand of executive decision makers in a very direct way. And again, we'll talk about why that is in a lot of detail in Module 1. The other power that Congress exercises that is extremely important and very direct is the appropriations power, the power over the budget. This is something that Congress doesn't have the option not to do. Right? If a budget doesn't get passed, the federal government shuts down, and we've lived through quite a few shutdowns in the past decade and a half, and they don't last very long, but they are costly and ugly. But basically, Congress has this responsibility to pass a budget, and it does every year, even if sometimes it gets done after the federal government has to close for a little while. It does pass one every year. And the budget is not just a responsibility of Congress's to pass every year. It is an opportunity to end run the normal status quo orientation, right? To pass a major piece of legislation could take forever, right? Immigration reform. Will we ever get an immigration reform bill? It's been on the agenda of both parties for at least 25 years, and nothing has happened. And it's very likely that nothing significant will happen until one party or the other controls Congress and the White House with a much stronger majority than currently exists and has existed recently. And even then, it might not be easy, because immigration is one of those issues that kind of cuts through various schisms within the party's coalitions. Congress has no responsibility to pass immigration reform, no matter how essentially clunky, outdated, broken the immigration system might be. It doesn't have that responsibility to do anything about it. And so the status quo orientation of our legislative system means that policy changes, policy reform in that way, could get postponed forever. The budget is not something that can be postponed forever. It can be postponed really, in reality, for a couple of weeks at the most, because government shutdowns that last longer than that are even more disruptive, and the political costs of allowing that to go on are too high, even in our very divisive political atmosphere right now. So having that responsibility, that actually creates an opportunity for Congress to exercise its biggest check on the power of particularly the executive branch, because most of the federal budget gets spent through the executive branch. The judicial branch has a small budget. The legislative branch also has a small budget. Not small for me as a person, or you as a person, or even as an institution, but compared to the overall federal outlays, the executive branch spends the vast majority of the budget that's passed by Congress. And money is power, in the sense that if you spend a lot of money on something, it's going to be done more effectively. If you spend less money on something, it's going to be done less effectively. So while Congress has a very difficult time passing major pieces of legislation or creating reform of existing systems, improving them, addressing problems that have come up since the last time that system was regulated by an act of Congress, each year it has the opportunity to set priorities that come through the appropriations process. So, for example, when George Bush was elected president, this is an old example, but I think it's a very telling one. His view on what the federal government should be doing was less regulation of the marketplace, particularly less regulation of financial marketplaces. Now, he could have pushed for Congress to pass a repeal of all of the laws on insider trading that were passed in the wake of the Great Depression and the subsequent regulations that have been created by Congress ever since, that created the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and that empowered that regulatory body. He could have done that, or at any point, whoever the president was, Congress could have either repealed or expanded, transformed the powers of the SEC and the other agencies that are doing similar work through legislation, through the normal statutory process. But instead, what is more likely to be done is to transform the way that agency does its statutorily empowered job by increasing or decreasing funding in various kinds of ways. And one of the things that the first George W. Bush budget contained was a significant cutback in budget for the Security and Exchange Commission's investigatory arm, so the SEC had to let go a lot of investigators. And what that means is, even though the same laws are still on the books, when you have less money to investigate violations of those laws, when you have less money to send people into the field to see if insider trading is being engaged in, and to follow the evidence that's there into successful prosecutions, that means that that rule, that law that exists on the books, is less effective. It's less potent. It's not the same as repealing it, but it's very similar to partially repealing it. And this goes across the board. If Congress appropriates more money for distributing vaccines rather than less money, then vaccines are going to be distributed more effectively and more efficiently. If Congress appropriates more money for providing subsidies to people in various industries or firms in various industries, that aid is going to get out there and that policy is going to be advanced. So the budget is a vehicle for policy preferences. It's not just, okay, here's the money you need to spend to enforce all the laws and make all the programs that Congress has set up function effectively. Laws don't enforce themselves. Programs don't automatically serve and benefit everybody they're intended to in their original authorizing legislation. The budget is what gives life and force to what the federal government does. And so the budget is an extraordinarily important policy vehicle, and it is the primary check that the legislature has on the executive branch. If the legislature gives extra money to something then for the executive branch to do, then the executive branch is going to be checked in the sense of saying, well, we didn't want to do that, so we're not going to. When Congress appropriates money, and actually an act of Congress requires the president to spend all appropriated monies, this was a result of a power struggle between the Nixon administration and the democratically controlled Congress. The Budget Impound Act forces the president to spend all appropriated money, instead of saying, which President Nixon did, well, you've given me this $20 million to do this with, but I'm not going to spend that money because I don't agree with the policy priorities behind that. So giving money to the executive branch is essentially forcing it to spend that money. Now, there's going to be some discretion as to how it spends it, but it has to spend it. Even more clearly, starving the executive branch of money for something is going to prevent the executive branch from doing what it wants. I would say probably the most notable example of that in recent memory is Donald Trump's wall was never funded by Congress. And even though he tried to search around in the existing budget for money to put towards that project, he had extremely limited success. There was a little bit of shifting money around that enabled some wall construction, some border wall construction to take place. But Congress was basically saying, yeah, you want to build this wall. We have authorizing legislation to, secure the border, but we're not giving you money for this particular thing. That's a check on the power of the president to do what he wants. The budget is really probably the most effective check in reality, not on paper, not in the constitutional scheme of things, but in the reality of how our system of government works. It's one of the reasons why we're going to spend an entire third of this class on the budget making process and on economic policy, because the way the government spends money, not just how much, but where that money comes from, and the sources of revenue for that money are all extraordinarily impactful on the power that Congress actually exercises in our policy-making system. So the position that Congress occupies in our system of checks and balances is that overall, in the grand scheme of things, it's the foundation of everything. The executive branch doesn't even exist in reality without the authorizing legislation from Congress. There's no Department of Education to pass out student loan grants and to do research. There's no Department of Energy to track nuclear materials. There's no Department of Health and Human Services to give out subsidies to poor people to buy health insurance, and thousands of other examples. There's none of that without first an authorizing piece of legislation that creates the agency, empowers the agency, and provides it with a statutory mandate for what it can do, what it can't do, and what it's responsible for doing. But more importantly, even when those things exist on paper, the lifeblood, the energy, is the money, the annual budget. And that is where Congress has its most ongoing power over the other branches. And that is really a power over the executive branch. They say the judicial branch, its budget is not key to the way it operates, the same way that that money is the key to the way the executive branch operates. So Congress is at the heart of our constitutional system. It has more theoretical power than either of the other two branches. The other two branches are, in a very meaningful way, subservient to it because they don't exist and they don't have any structure from themselves and from the Constitution. They only exist and have structure and force and responsibilities and powers because Congress gives it to them. Now, there are some exceptions, right? The president has certain kinds of sources of power that are independent of the legislature, but they're few. There really aren't very many. And also, as I said, the judicial branch can, through court rulings, can provide procedures for itself, but those procedures are subject to future court rulings that overturn them. But most of what goes on in the judicial branch happens because of procedural rules that were passed through the regular legislative process in Congress. So Congress is foundational to the way our system looks. Its status quo orientation makes that foundational power very difficult to use, except for through the budget. So that's the place that Congress has. One of the things that makes Congress a very frustrating institution for a lot of Americans is that it does have this foundational power and responsibility, yet because of the status quo orientation, the difficulty of getting anything done, and that's not just true in our very divided times, it's always been the case, and we'll talk about this quite a bit, that foundational role seems to not be done as effectively as maybe the American people would like it to. The voice of the people speaks directly through the legislative process, and when in reality the legislative process is very difficult to move, get going, and get things across the finish line, it's very frustrating because the super important place that Congress occupies in our system of government seems to be undercut by the difficulty of it doing that very important, very big job, with the exception of the budget. And we will look very closely at not just what's so status quo oriented about Congress and what the factors are that produce that, but very deeply at the appropriations process and how it all goes down, so that the way the federal budget is set, it becomes very, very clear to you. And that extremely important power of Congress is going to be something that you understand how it happens much more clearly. Okay, that is the introductory lecture. It's not very civicsy in the sense that you probably could, there's information about official checks and balances. I didn't tell how many votes are needed for a veto override, didn't talk about all the various kinds of checks and balances that might be on that sort of basic diagram, but that's not the point of this. The point of this is to understand the spiritual place that Congress occupies in our system of government. And spiritually, its most important, most effective power is over the budget. Okay, until the next module, that's all for now.